the SELIMETRY trial was investigating a rare group of patients with advanced thyroid cancer. Generally with thyroid cancer, the first line treatment we use is radioactive iodine, which is highly effective because thyroid and thyroid cancer cells selectively take up iodine. So by using radioactive iodine, we can deliver high doses of radiation to kill the cancer cells, and that's usually a very effective treatment. But in a proportion of patients, they become the thyroid cancer cells become resistant to iodine uptake. They no longer take up the iodine, so we can't use that treatment anymore, and the cancer progresses. Now, there are increasing numbers of drug treatments available to treat that situation, but those drugs have quite a lot of side effects. So the concept for the trial was to see whether there may be ways that we can resensitize thyroid cancer cells that have become resistant to iodine to take up iodine again, to allow iodine to be a useful treatment again. And that way we can give a treatment that has much less in the way of side effects, but continues to control the cancer. So the approach that we use to try and resensitize the cells is to use a targeted cancer drug called Selumetinib. So this drug, we know from preclinical work, it can affect the pathways that cause resistance to iodine uptake in thyroid cancer cells. So there'd been a previous pilot study that had shown in a small number of patients some success in giving a short course of the Selumetinib, so 4 weeks of the Selumetinib, and then re-scanning the patients to see if they took up iodine again. And that pilot study showed some considerable success. In a significant proportion of patients the cells were resensitized to take up iodine again. So what we aimed to do in our trial was to repeat this in a larger number of patients, and to try and assess the clinical efficacy, the clinical benefit really of this treatment approach. So the primary endpoint for the study was intended to be progression-free survival for patients who had increased iodine uptake following the Selumetinib, and then went on to have radioiodine treatment, and to allow us to compare that with historical data to see, did this approach actually mean that the cancer was controlled for longer in patients who achieved more iodine uptake following Selumetinib? Now, what we found in the trial was, slightly disappointingly, a lower proportion of patients than we had expected from the pilot work did achieve an increase in iodine uptake following Selumetinib. Having said that, a significant number of people did achieve increased uptake and did go on to receive radioiodine. But unfortunately, because the proportion that got that far was smaller than expected, the study was actually underpowered then to report the primary endpoint. But what we did find was a trend towards improved progression-free survival for patients who had Selumetinib and then were able to go on and have radioiodine. We did also report that the Selumetinib course did have, patients did experience more side effects than seem to have been reported previously with this drug. And I think that's an important finding, because part of the whole justification of this approach was to try and establish a treatment that might have less in the way of side effects, be less upsetting for patients, and less effect on quality of life. That said, although the toxicity reported was higher than had previously been reported, there didn't seem to be a particularly adverse effect on patients' quality of life that we could measure. Now, in many ways, I think the most important findings from this study relate to work that we did around the radioiodine treatment, and being able to measure the dose, radiation dose that we delivered to the cancer, which is not something that's ever really been done before in a clinical trial, certainly not in a multicenter clinical trial. And that did allow us to do some really interesting work, showing that we could actually predict the radiation dose that might be delivered to tumors by doing a pre-treatment scan. And so doing pre-treatment and then post-treatment scans, we were able to demonstrate that the dose that was predicted from the pre-treatment scan was indeed delivered by the iodine treatment that was given. And that has really important implications moving forward for treatment of many patients with thyroid cancer, not just patients in this rare scenario of having iodine refractory disease.